So I'll try to explain as dumbed down as possible, like the COP and how it's so much better than like a stock magneto. Let's assume for the sake of this discussion that a stock magneto can hold true timing, true fixed timing from to let's say to 12,000, 16,000 RPM. Let's just assume that. So they're in the same category. Well, what happens is at higher RPMs, the way the engine's designed, piston rings, they're not grooved, the pistons aren't drilled out, blah, blah, blah. The way everything's set up. We're going to have loss of compression ratio after 4,000 RPM, higher and higher and higher, more and more loss, the more higher RPMs we get up into become from harmonic vibration in the piston rings, right? So we already know this, right? This is proven stuff. Like nothing I say in my videos is my opinion. It's fact, right? It's just the way I'm wording it and the way you perceive and pick it up and hear it, right? So that's where we can lose a little translation. So a stock pickup, let's assume they hold true timing. After 4,000 RPM, the more and more we climb, the more and more spark power we need to make sure we can get full combustion. Well, the stock transistorized magneto is only designed to produce the minimum amount of power for its applicable sold usage, which is up to 3,500 RPM. So the higher we climb, there's no spark potential there. There's no extra power to tap into, right? So that's why having all this extra power from the COP is where we're going to shine. Assuming that the stock magneto and all of them hold true timing, that's the only way that they even get put into the same category. But where it would outshine if they were in the same category is the fact that there's no more power to tap into once we climb up higher and higher and higher, and we do need that power. It's just a basic understanding of how these engines work, the fuel type, the ignition, and the mechanical engineering side, the internal combustion engine, right? How all these components work together is, this is the fact. If the power is not there and we require more power, more and more and more, the higher we run this engine under load, holding it at high RPMs as well. That's a big factor too, right? If the spark power is not there, we're not going to have the same percentage of combustion that we did at lower RPM that we did at high RPM. That's where the COP comes in and shines, right? Assuming that the stock one does hold the 12, 16,000. So hopefully that's a little bit of insight to you guys, right? So when you want to understand fully in one of these engines, right, you just got to understand the fuel and how the fact that the fuel has air and fuel ratio, that air is a small percentage of oxygen and mostly nitrogen. The fuel and the air, the oxygen, ignite and preheat the nitrogen. The nitrogen expands and pushes the piston down. That's how an internal combustion engine works with gasoline, okay? So that's the mechanism. The gasoline takes a certain amount of time to flame up, to produce the heat. That's your spark duration, right? Does that make sense? We need a certain amount of time to make that process happen, right? So if that process takes a certain amount of time to happen, it's got to happen a certain amount of time in the stroke so we can produce the expanding gases and have it expanding at its max time to produce power, right? So different fuel types allow you to have less pressure built up on this side of the crank, a slower ignition time, so you can still produce the same amount of torque, but there's less pressure built up pre-crank angle, so there's less breakage and restriction on the internal parts of the engine. That's why running a different fuel type can get you more performance. Running a different fuel type will require changing the mathematics, that the way you look at the engine, right? So based off of the flame front or the flammability, right, the time in which it takes for the fuel that you are running, right? If it's faster fuel than gasoline, then you would have to apply that to the factors I explained in this video, right? You would want to change your spark duration. You would want to make sure you had the spark potential and power to climb to those RPMs. You will be able to climb to higher RPMs with a faster burning fuel because you'll have less internal stress on the engine because of the factors I just explained. Gasoline has to have a certain amount of time to do its job. That's why we get a lot of pre-crank angle pressure, right? But that's what builds torque. Well, if we can do the same amount of, produce the same amount of torque, but have the less amount of pre-crank angle, right? That means that we have less strain and restriction on the engine. We'll have more torque and more higher RPMs. So hopefully this is an informative video for some guys.